hit the old record button here. So we are now recording. And for anyone who doesn't want to be on video, just letting you know. All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining us. We before we get into really anything, the timing of this couldn't have been more. I don't want to call it better, but an important timing. So obviously, yesterday's news of the court case was an important event that is in some ways directly related to what we're talking today, and in other ways not always so directly. But it'll for sure. I'm sure Philip and Barbara, you're both. It'll be informing some of what you talk about today. I would imagine. So, all right, we have another person coming in. As we go through this, if you'd like to ask a question, feel free to ask verbally if you'd like, but you can also chat to me the question or chat to everyone the question. Not either way, we'll make sure that we get to that. And I should also say before we get started, Barbara, you'll probably appreciate me saying something to the effect of that nothing in this webinar should be considered as legal advice. So I know whenever we have a lawyer on the line, that's always something good to say, right? So I wanted to say that. Okay, so what I'd like to get started with is just a quick word about who we have on our panel today. So I'm going to share a PowerPoint, but I promise you this is not a PowerPoint webinar. Okay, but just a couple of slides to get us started so that we can, give me one moment and just to make sure I am queued up correctly on this. So here we go. All right, so what I want to do is just introduce everyone to our panelists today. So first we have Philip Berry, founder and president of Philip Berry Associates. A few words on Philip, that he and his organization bring consulting and coaching to organizations and teams in a wide range of areas, all with an eye towards increasing effectiveness and impact. Today, of course, he's here to provide insight into the DEI space, but he provides consulting on organizational challenges and strategies across the board. You can see his incredible experience working for some amazing organizations. And while he does reside in New York, note that he's lived in Paris and worked all over Europe, Latin America, Asia, Africa, Middle East, Eastern Europe, and Russia. So you must have a lot of passports to fill all those up. Philip is also a speaker and writer. He's penned many articles, and he has a book called Being Better Than You Believe, 8 Steps to Ultimate Success. And Philip, you may or may not know this, but there's a reviewer on Amazon that called that an owner's manual for our lives. So I think those are some pretty good words there. Okay, and Barbara, welcome. Thank you for joining as well. Barbara is a practicing attorney of 30 years. She's the founder of B.L. Johnson Law, as well as a counsel with Potter and Murdoch, because Barbara, I guess working for one law firm just isn't enough for you. Barbara represents employers of all sizes and industries, from global 500s to nonprofits, educational institutions, manufacturers. She provides counsel on DEI programs and matters, as well as setting the proper cultures for DEI. But she also represents clients and provides counsel on the full range of employment-related matters. She's particularly adept at navigating complex allegations of misconduct with executives and the like, allegations of disparate treatment that require statistical analyses. And Barbara also co-hosts a podcast called Today's Workplace, which discusses the intersection of employment law and human potential. And I was actually listening to one of those just this morning, and it's great. So thank you. All right, and now I get the awkward opportunity of introducing myself. I have been in HR for over 20 years, providing support and counsel on the full range of HR matters. Our team at PEAR provides outsourced HR management support, policy development, day-to-day employee relations issues, support for investigations and harassment training. And we also provide leadership development and coaching to leaders at all levels, from CEOs to first-line managers. If you work with us, you get a whole team to support you and your employees and we're very customized and personal in the way we do things. You know, most employees know me as I get on the phone, I'm Dave with HR. So we have an amazing, dedicated team, and I am proud to work with each and every one of them. Okay, PowerPoint done. So thank you for letting me get through that. So without further ado, why don't we get into things here? Philip, you've been involved in DEI initiatives for many years, and Barbara, you've counseled employers on how to establish DEI programs for years as well. Philip, maybe we'll start with you. Maybe you could describe for us the evolution in corporate America of the concept of diversity and inclusion.
You know, it's interesting. First of all, I want to thank PEAR and David and Deidre for this opportunity to work with Barbara on this effort. You know, over a span of years, you get to meet a lot of people on your journey. And Barbara and I, we've connected before, and now we're reconnecting on this effort. So really glad to see that. And it's like reading a book, and good book, and you turn the pages, and the story is still great. So glad to be with Barbara on this. When I think about the whole evolution, I have to go back 30, and honestly, I probably should go back even more years than that in terms of my own experience in this area of diversity and inclusion. So when you look at it, a lot of the efforts and initiatives that are in place started with an external desire by individuals to begin to get more, started with getting more Blacks into organizations. So it came, the stem of it really came from the civil rights movement. Yeah, and that also put an impetus on a number of individuals to begin to address internally, first, how can we recruit and eliminate barriers that keep Blacks from moving into an organization and providing value. It progressed pretty far from that. And let me give you a definition. To me, diversity has to do with recognizing the rich talents and dimensions that individuals bring to an organization based upon their difference. And so when you look at all of the different dimensions, of course, race is one, but we have begun to see efforts starting up with women in the organization. How can we get more women in the organization? So we started to approach it from the standpoint of gender after a while. That wasn't the first thing that was addressed in organizations in the beginning, in organizations that I was involved in. And then we started progressing and understanding that there are other dimensions. And so how can we get Hispanics or Latinx into an organization? And how can we begin to get Asians into the organization? Now, how can we address issues of sexual orientation from LGBTQ? How can we begin to look at individuals who are differently abled? How can we begin to start looking at millennials? You know, and so what happened is that organizations began to progress, and we saw a number of groups internally, whether they're called affinity groups, employee resource groups, a number of names for those type of groups, but they began to network groups, they were called in many places, but these are groups of individuals who are representing each of those dimensions. And we're working with an organization to get organizations to address concerns to them. So that's really the first part. And it seems that we are continuing with this evolution in a number of different areas. And Barbara and I will talk about that as we go along the way.
All right, great, thank you. All right, so and related, Barbara, you know, I think we're even in the name of this webinar here, we're calling it diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so clearly something, it seems that something has changed along the way. So maybe you can talk a little bit about this addition of equity.
Yeah, equity is a new term that has been inserted between diversity and inclusion. And equity is the concept of giving employees fair treatment, access, and opportunity, but also recognizing the barriers that have existed with respect to individuals historically, as far as underrepresented groups. And so one way to describe equity is to think about what's happening in many organizations with respect to pay equity for women in the organization, for people of color in the organization, recognizing this historical unfairness and trying to address it. So that's equity. And I also have a slide, which I think is a great demonstrative when we think about equity. And it's kind of the difference between equity and equality. So here we have the three folks looking at the game, and they're looking over the fence. So that's equality. And you can see one person can't see at all, one can barely see over the fence. And that's equity. It's when you boost them up. But then the third piece, which I find most interesting, if you go to the next slide, is why is the fence there in the first place? And that's the real question in thinking about liberation and removing barriers. Why is there the fence? Does there need to be the fence? So I think that's a great illustration of this concept of equality versus equity.
Absolutely. That's really great. Okay. All right. Thanks, Barbara. So Philip, I think, I was ready to ask this question anyway, and then what happened yesterday really is now looming large. Thinking about things going on in the community, in the media, related to diversity and these types of issues. And I'm wondering, how does a business take what's going on in the media, take what's going on in the community, and translate those into business initiatives?
The one thing that's important and that organizations are beginning to understand more and more is that the people that work in those organizations, they are impacted by things that are happening to them in their household. They are impacted by issues that are going on in their community. They are impacted by a number of external issues, and they bring that to the workplace. And so when they bring that to the workplace, individuals can feel a sense of detachment, and they are preoccupied with a number of these things. And on one level, it will provide a barrier for individuals as they're trying to do their work productively. So organizations can't ignore some of the things that are going on externally. The issue around George Floyd, I mean, it's almost a year now. It's been a year since he died. However, in a number of issues that I've been involved with in organizations, all of them are saying, how can we begin to show that we care about these issues around George Floyd? And also that coupled with that is the Black Lives Matters pieces that, that have also been very prevalent. And so organizations are saying, what can we do? How can we address this? And it's important for them to begin that conversation. So, and beginning the conversation, an important way to do that is one, just to have a dialogue in an organization. So that way people can talk about it. We spend more than 18 hours of any particular day we're working, especially now that we're working remotely. We're involved with work in some ways or another. And so it's important to let people have an outlet where they can talk about this, where they can support each other, where they can begin to talk about how they can do better wherever they might be located. And so organizations need to be able to show that they're sensitive to their people, and also that they care about a number of the things that are happening societally. And that all has to do with a company's brand. Organizations, each individuals have a brand, organizations have a brand. It's how they are viewed by significant others who look at them. And so is an organization demonstrating in some way or another that it is caring, that it cares about this, that it's concerned about some of these things? And then how can they begin to look internally to say, okay, what can we do differently internally with the mix of our employees, given some of these external situations? And that's where they begin to set up strategies, conversations, training, They might decide that they're going to interface differently with other external groups. For example, if we look at all of the businesses, to take it to another issue where because of the pandemic, a number of organizations, small businesses, they're going out of business. And so how can we have organizations showing that they're sensitive and that they care about that? So one thing that, for example, I use Chase Manhattan Bank just as an example, where they decided that what they're going to do is to put together a fund that is going to help small businesses so that they can resurrect the way they're approaching their business. You find Amex on another issue has decided that they're going to do a lot more proactive things with small businesses and also with women-owned businesses. You see a number of organizations saying that we need to have more women in STEM in our organization. And so how can we show that we're sensitive to some of these issues by supporting women in STEM training programs, educational efforts, because that's all going to come back to us in a positive way. I'll talk about this more later, but that's a beginning point of this branding and sensitivity standpoint that organizations need to demonstrate. You can't just be in a vacuum and be separate from all of these things and believe that they don't exist. They don't impact you.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, in the HR work that we do, you know, with harassment trainings and just other conversations I'm constantly saying to employees, you know, you don't check who you are at the door, right? It's not you don't just take off the color of your skin or your disability or anything like that, like taking off your coat, right? So what's happening in the community is happening every day in the workplace. Barbara, I want to something that Philip just said actually leads me to ask you a question, which is Philip is talking about. So obviously, just to state in case we need to, what happened yesterday, of course, that former police officer Derek Chauvin was convicted of on multiple counts in the death of George Floyd. So I obviously this is something big happening in the national community right now. Barbara, something that Philip just said was about you can't ignore what's happening in the community. We should be having conversations. You're a lawyer. Aren't these conversations kind of dangerous? Isn't this what can lead to a client calling you?
No, I disagree. I think
Okay.
that it is so important to have the conversations. You know, one of the things I highly advocate is involving the C-suite from the CEO on down. And one of the first things that I suggest that companies that are kind of new to this journey is having I call them courageous conversations within the C-suite, where people do have a safe space to talk about what their experiences have been, but also to understand the expectation of the leadership of the organization in this area. And I think it's so important that the C-suite educate themselves as opposed to, you know, doing a little training, thinking that's all that there is. It's important to educate. Each person has to educate themselves. And so having those conversations is really, really important, because you don't want things to fester. Because guess what? If you don't talk about them, people are still going to be talking about them, you know, when we're face to face in the lunchroom or, you know, wherever,
Yeah.
people are going to have conversations. One of the most effective responses I've seen to the George Floyd murder was simply having listening sessions. I mean, listening sessions where people actually just talked about what their experiences had been. And I know that there were some law firms that did that. And I think it was so impactful, because how often do you hear from the person in the mailroom who has had, you know, terrible experiences with the police? You don't hear about those
Right.
from someone you know. And so just having those courageous conversations can be really, really impactful. So no, rather than thinking that that's a problem, if they're handled correctly, I think they can be very important.
Great. Okay. And you sort of touched on then the starting with the C-suite, right? So clearly you're talking about kind of getting buy-in on from that group in a company, right?
Yeah. So often I think historically, um, diversity and inclusion has been kind of from the bottom up, right? We really want you to do this. We need you to do this. Listen to us, as opposed to leadership recognizing we really want to be inclusive, right? So
Right.
it's so important to have that top-down approach.
Okay, that's great. Thanks, Barbara. All right, so let's get into initiatives themselves, right? We've decided we're putting in some sort of strategy, some sort of initiative, and maybe Philip, you can talk about some of the key areas that an organization should direct their efforts.
But yeah, David, when a number of the issues started coming into the forefront around diversity, one of the things that individuals said is that we need to have more efforts that are based not just on bringing people of different races or gender into the organization. We need to have an effort that creates an environment where we can, an environment of connection and involvement, where diversity is put into action, and it's put into action in three different areas. One, in the workforce, which really has to do with a lot of the talent management issues and recruiting and developing, getting individuals in. Now, so workforce is one area. The other is in the workplace. And so, for example, when Barbara talks about having courageous conversations and having an environment where individuals feel that they can be more engaged in the organization, they can feel more a part of the organization, that they can have these conversations at work, that it's an area where people show that, hey, my superiors in the executive suite care enough about me so that way they will allow me to have these conversations, which I'm going to have anyway. In fact, what used to happen in the earlier days is that individuals would have these, before we had employee resource groups that were validated and chartered by organizations, you had groups of women or African Americans or Hispanics. They would talk outside after work about the organization, about what was happening good and what was not happening well with them in the organization. So what we wanted to do was to legitimate this as an important area of discourse, so that way we can all learn from it. And as we are talking about the workplace, we want to educate everybody, so that way they can understand a lot more about each other and the type of things that are impacting them. So we wanted to get away from some of the antagonistic conflict type of issues that began in some of the earlier days, to saying, how can we together work on these type of issues so that way together we can improve things. That's why it's so enlightening. It was so enlightening to see this year with Black Lives Matters. It wasn't just Black individuals who were walking the streets. It was young millennials out there. I mean, you look at what's happening with George Floyd in Minnesota. People know Minnesota very well. You see that those type of issues, there are people of all persuasions that are involved in this conversation now. And so the millennials, this whole next generation of individuals, they are looking and expecting more from the workplace. And then the third area has to do with what can we do in the marketplace differently. And so here, what we're looking at is organizations developing a more enlightened self-interest. And I'll talk about this more later. The self-interest means that they care not just about their profits, but they care about the products that they produce, the services that they deliver, and also how are these products and services impacting people who are our consumers. And can we ensure that we are meeting the needs of these individuals by delivering products that are going to help them and make it more satisfying to them? It might mean that we have different language issues that we have to address. And so let's have commercials in dual languages. Let's speak Mandarin. Let's Hispanic individuals. All of those when we're advertising. When we are looking at different products that we have, how can we? Matter of fact, I've worked a lot, as you were saying. Let me say this, and I'll move on. I've worked a lot internationally. One of the most important things I've learned in working internationally is that you need to not put a US way of operating and on people. you need to find out, how are people consuming this particular product in their area? And how can I make modifications to that product? So I might go to a place like the Philippines and I'll say, well, look, individuals they use water in a different way with their shampoos or with their body wash. I need to understand that from a chemical perspective. I need to understand the science behind my products with that, so that way I can deliver it better and more effectively. How can I meet the needs of consumers in that way? So those are three areas: the workplace, workforce, and also the marketplace.
That's amazing.
There's
Yeah.
a fourth area, and I'll come up into that later.
All right. All right. So Barbara, I guess kind of dovetailing to that. So let's say, a company is embarking on these three areas or four, as Philip is talking about. How do we make sure that it's sustainable, that it's not just like a one-shot deal, right? And then
Good question. And unfortunately, many employers have kind of a knee-jerk reaction, and they kind of go over here and go over there. What's so important is to have a strategy, just like you would with any other business imperative. If you're trying to develop a new product to go to market, you come up with a strategy, a timeline, and a plan. And the effective way to develop a sustainable strategy, something that's going to work, is what I call the qualitative and the quantitative analysis. So going into this process, you start by a qualitative analysis where you actually interview people, find out what they're feeling, find out what they're thinking, have focus groups, preferably with third parties who come in and talk to your employees, and you'll be very surprised what they may be telling an outsider that they're not telling you or that you don't know. But you have to be prepared to accept the results. I mean, I can't tell you the number of employers who are like shocked when they get the results back of the focus group. They say, I had no idea people felt that way. Well, you never asked them before. And the worst thing you can do is to be in denial. And I've also seen that where this can't be true. You put the report in the drawer and that's the end of it. You have to be prepared to act on what you hear and incorporate that into a strategy to address those perceptions. And the second piece is the quantitative piece, the data, the numbers that are going to determine and help you understand whether your strategy is successful. So find that baseline. Do a pay equity analysis. Do we have issues? How are we going to address it? Look at your hiring, look at what your numbers have been, what the turnover has been, what the exit interviews say. So looking at the entire work cycle with the idea of understanding where we are and using that information to develop a sustainable strategy.
Okay. All right. That's great. So let's talk about, so that we're talking about some of the things that we should do, perhaps some of the great ways of approaching this. Maybe for either one or both of you, what are some of the mistakes that you see happening when organizations try to put some DEI programs into place?
I want to build on something that Barbara said.
Sure.
Because there are three areas that I see as big mistake areas. And so the first has to do with not having a way of involving people, as Barbara was saying. And you involve people by getting their input and getting their understanding in a qualitative and in a quantitative manner. You build upon that. Now, one of the things, I'll give you an example of a mistake that an organization made, and that is that they said, well, what we're going to do in order to address issues with the Black community, we're going to let everyone have Martin Luther King Day off, his birthday off. It was seem on face value. Well, it's a nice thing to do. Well, in the focus group that I conducted with people, they said, what would have been better, is not to just assume we all want a day off, but why don't you have a day of action and caring where everybody in the organization can contribute to some social good and show that the company is concerned about these type of issues that Martin Luther King talked about, that he espoused, and also that as a company, we care about these things. That would be more impactful. And so they said, if somebody had just asked us, instead of just assuming, that this holiday would be a good thing, they would have learned a lot. So involving people is important. Two, it's important to, as an effort is underway, to communicate with your internal and external stakeholders regarding what you're doing, the progress that you're making, the status that what you have completed so far, and what the status of your organization is. Just like senior leaders want to know what's happening on a quarter-to-quarter basis. Employees, if you say that you're going to start an effort and then they don't hear from you in another year, until maybe the next annual meeting, that you don't involve them, you don't keep them encouraged, you don't have them feeling that there's some effort that is taking place, and letting people just know along the way, communicating with them internally, with your employees, and externally with other key people that need to know what you're doing. It could be at your shareholders meetings, for example, your investor relations meetings, where the investor, because there's a lot of activity now that is taking place in investor circles and at shareholder meetings, where shareholders are asking questions. Well, what is our company doing about these efforts? So by having something there where you just communicate that, that's going to be very important to them. And then the third area is be able to develop a set of short, middle, and long range goals. And I would say that the short range goals happen to be low hanging fruit. Have some significant areas of accomplishment, things that you can accomplish right away. So that way people at least can feel that there's some movement in this area. Or else what happens is that people get disheartened and then they're going to say, nothing is happening, nothing is happening. Well, you want to make sure that you don't project a problem and outline it. Well, this is going to we're going to recruit women in the C-suite in 2 years. We're going to increase the number from 30% up to 50%. Well, there's some steps in between that. So when you are outlining your strategic efforts, and Barbara's talking about strategy, your strategy has to include a long-term step and also what are the action steps along the way that can help you, so that way you can move incrementally towards the point that you raised and that you were concerned about. So those are three things that I think: communication, right, involvement, and being able to pace, not race, in terms of your goals and objectives.
Right. Philip, you just mentioned something about that these types of initiatives, this progress, this is boards want to know about this type of stuff. And it reminded me, we have some clients that are in dealing with their own proposals, RFPs and the like, that those are now coming in more and more often, wanting to know what are your diversity initiatives within your company, right? And they make their decision on whether or not they're going to go with the company based on some of that. Barbara, Philip just mentioned a little bit about recruiting, and I've heard you talk about this before, so I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that. Maybe historically, or it's been about, well, if we want to improve our diversity, it's all about the recruiting.
Well, Philip gave some examples of things that employers do not so well. And this area of recruiting is a great example. Employers focus on identifying diverse talent and getting diverse talent in the door. That's not enough, because you can get all the diverse talent you want to come join your organization. But unless your culture is inclusive, unless you have looked at those things in your culture that make people feel as if they don't belong there and create that sense of belonging, it doesn't matter. So you really need to look at not just recruiting, but the entire work cycle to ensure that you are removing those barriers, because recruiting certainly is just not enough.
Right. And that cycle is performance reviews, training,
performance evaluations, development, every aspect of
right. Okay.
Philip, before we go on, though, I just
please
add at least one other what I think misstep that employers take. Very often employers think we'll solve the problem by getting some unconscious bias training. And there's a huge industry now with respect to unconscious bias training. And the training is great. I'm not in any way putting down the training, but that's not the end. And I think that's a major problem, or misperception that employers have, is that we're going to train our people not to discriminate. We're going to train them not to exercise their biases, and that's kind of the end of it. And as I said, that's really not, in my view, very effective. Or the other, the hottest job in town right now has to be a diversity, equity, and inclusion specialist. So companies think, okay, in fact, I had somebody tell me this last summer. We just posted for a new diversity, equity, and inclusion person, and we hired a search firm that we're going to pay $1 gazillion to, and they're going to go find us somebody, and that's going to solve our problems. No, until the senior leadership understands the issue, commits to the issue, and develops that strategy, it's not going to work well.
Right. Okay. Philip, let me ask you about, we talked a little bit about what's happening right now in the news and what's happening nationally. And I'm wondering, how do we, we want that to inform what we're doing on the one hand, but on the other hand, we don't want these emotional reactions and emotions that are happening get in the way of putting in sound business strategies. So how do we deal with that?
I think that one of the things we have to realize that when we're dealing with people who work for us, we need to understand that the whole person needs to come to work. And we need to understand that that whole person is being impacted by a number of things that are happening in the external world. And that's why having these courageous conversations where people can talk about that, and also where people can learn and they can heal each other, where they can begin to work with each other on what can we do differently internally, given those things that are happening externally, what can we do internally? And so, for example, if somebody would say, like, what's another issue that's going to be coming up? The whole issue around Stop AAPI Hate. And that's a big issue. And so organizations shouldn't make like it doesn't exist. So what are some things that we can do internally to look at our processes and to look at our workforce and our workplace and contributions that individuals are making? Can we do something different so that way we aren't replicating hateful type of practices or policies internally that negate that for the people that work with us? And then the other piece is externally, from the standpoint, another pillar that I would put in place in addition to workforce, workplace, and marketplace is community. And that is, what are some organizations that we can invest in so that way we can show from a social responsibility standpoint that we care, that this is important to us. Organizations have been doing that all along the way. They participate in their health programs, the educational programs, issues around the development of STEM programs. So could we do more in those areas? So that way we can show that we're concerned about these areas and make an impact. I would say carve out an area where you can establish your footprint and do good based upon even your own corporate philosophy in terms of how you approach things. So maybe if you're a certain type of a consumer product company, you want to say, let's look at health in this particular area because we know that that's going to be important. With all of the stuff that's going on with COVID, what can we do differently there to educate people? There's so many ways that one can set up a footprint that begins to establish that they're sensitive to these issues and that they care about it and let people know about it.
Okay, that's great. So thanks, Philip. So Barbara, let's move to the with any strategy, any initiative you put into place, best practice says that you should measure it, right? How do we know that what we did worked? So I guess what in a DEI initiative, what are we looking for? What are the things that tell us that what we're doing is having an impact, that it's working?
Well, we talked about a few minutes ago the importance of starting with a quantitative analysis. So you already have a starting point, and looking at those numbers along the way to see whether or not your strategy is indeed working. The other piece of this, which has been very interesting to observe over the last few years is whether you make those numbers public. And historically, as an employment attorney, it was like, absolutely not, no way, we're not going to tell anybody. Oh my God, this could be awful. And I think in fact, I have a good friend who was my client at one point when he was practicing as an attorney, and he went on to become a VP of Human Resources. He said, when I was an attorney, Barbara, I thought just like you, but now that I'm the VP of HR, I understand it's really important to share this information. And I mean, I think you have to work with your in-house counsel, outside counsel, to decide on the level of risk and exactly what you share. But it really is important to be somewhat transparent as far as sharing that information and letting people know how you are. Yes, there is exposure, but if you're working on it and you're working to improve it and you're doing all the right things, then it's probably a risk that's worth taking.
Absolutely. You know, we implement morale and culture surveys with our clients, and we're always kind of counseling on the fear with the leadership of sharing that information, right? That should I be really sharing it? And sure, maybe not every data point and not every comment that you get in should be shared with everybody. That's probably not. Maybe you can be too transparent, but on the other hand, if you don't, then what was the point, right? That there's people want to know that you've heard them, and showing them that you're making changes, you're making efforts to bring in change. All right, thank you. So shifting a little bit to how to put in these strategies and how to measure it and all that, Philip, a question that maybe some clients of ours, anyone who might be on this meeting right now, is the company's already diverse, right? What maybe depending on the type of company, it's all African Americans and Hispanics, and it's mostly women, right? It seems on the face of it like it's a really diverse company. We don't need something like a DEI strategy. What would you say to that?
I think that it's a mistake to feel that you have won it and done it by having a certain number of people of a certain race and gender in a certain place. That there are other horizons that organizations can take that are extremely important. And let me give you a personal example of something that a company that I work with did. That is that when I was vice president of the Latin American division for this company, one of the things that we said, well, there are a number of people from different Latin countries that were moving into senior levels. Well, we said another horizon for us is let's move somebody from Latin America over to be the country manager of Romania. Let's move somebody from Colombia over to China. Let's move a female over to China. So that way she can take the leadership as managing director of that particular organization. Let's move let's move Philip over to Paris to be over HR for all of Europe, all of Western Europe. And then let's begin to look at how he can develop that organization more, all of those different countries there. So there are always other horizons that organizations have that they need to take another look at. So that's why I would say that with data, it helps you to understand where you are and then look at your current state and then say, what would be a good future state? How can we, for example, get more women? If we say that not only are women important in STEM, let's have a person who is a female scientist in a certain, who's head of the whole R&D area. Don't just say that you just want a female who's going to be a scientist. Let's get a person who is Asian and let's move that person into the legal department, so that because we found, in fact, the work that I was doing with the Asian Society found that there was a quote unquote bamboo ceiling of Asians moving out of the scientific areas into certain other areas in certain companies, so let's make that move. So I always say there are always some areas that one can go into to go the next level.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Philip. So Barbara, something Philip said actually much earlier in the hour was that kind of in the evolution of DEI, that it started out just about Blacks, but then that has moved on to others. But at the same time, 2020, one could argue, was all about Black Lives Matter, or or a lot about it. And I'm wondering, what about, is that the right focus that should be happening right now? This emphasis on Blacks in America or in corporations? Are we creating factions, special groups? Shouldn't we be, as people like to say, colorblind? And what do you say to that?
No, because I'll tell you an anecdote. My husband is African American, and after the George Floyd murder, someone that he had worked with for many years said to him, when I see you, I don't see color. And his response was, well, you haven't looked at me in the last 10 years. I mean, how can you be colorblind? I mean, it's part of my experience. And I think that's the myth is, and so in terms of the emphasis on Blacks in the workplace, particularly, I think it's well-founded for the equity piece. I mean, I was encouraged in a way because last summer was the first time that I heard anyone in corporate America utter the words institutional racism. But that's a reality. Institutional racism is a reality. And unless you understand that history and kind of how we got to where we are, it's very, very difficult to move the needle. So I'm not suggesting that one kind of diversity is more important than other kinds of diversity, but we've made progress in many of these areas, and the progress has been sorely lacking when it comes to Blacks in the workplace.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. Thanks.
David, I'm wondering if, just in light of time,
Yeah.
if we can shift and just see if there's some questions before you go through other, there may be some questions that you have there, but I think it would be good to, I'm wondering if we have stimulated, some thoughts.
Absolutely.
And we don't have as much time on that as I'd like to have. So
right. No,
I will promise to be succinct in my responses.
If anybody has a question, please speak up or send a chat. Deirdre, I think you raised your hand.
I did. Something that first of all, this is so wonderful. I cannot thank you all enough. Listening to Barbara, talking about the C-suite, having courageous conversations, them needing to be educated first, totally agree, top down. And then hearing Philip, it's the millennials, when you look at who's participating in, whether it's creating their own corporate social responsibility efforts. We have a client who's doing a sip and scribble and is helping, reaching out. So there's a generational divide to begin with, having nothing to do with race or there's just there has always been, and it's grown bigger because the generational divide is disparate. We have management styles and belief systems from the 70s and the 80s and maybe the 90s now that are sort of C-suite. And then you've got millennials and Gen Zs who are much more open and in touch and educated. So as I was listening to the two of you, that's one thing that came to my mind, and I'm thinking perhaps one way is to really have the champions be the millennials, right? Everybody's always focused on how do we make millennials happy in the workplace? There's so much turnover, and we don't have a corporate social responsibility activity. We should do that. We should give more flexible hours. We should allow more, roller skates and Cheerios or Lucky Charms for breakfast. Whatever anybody is doing to try to make millennials and now, of course, Gen Z's happier in the workplace. But if they are more educated and in tune, perhaps they are the ones to be chosen to lead in some way and guide and champion for the C-suite. Because I don't see, that's just, I don't know what you think about that. That's just what I was thinking in my head.
I'll answer it. I'll give you one quick example on something with that, an organization that did something to work the chasm, because first of all, the age issue is another aspect of diversity. So it's not just about race and gender. That's another aspect, and we need to understand that. And therefore, one of the things that this company did, there was a CEO of whose name unfortunately escapes me right now, because that's what happens, with my generation right now. But one of the things that he did was that in order to increase his understanding of computers and how to work it, he had a mentor. He had a mentor who was younger than him to help him so he could understand how to use technology better. And it really helped them quite a bit. And in fact, there was a study that was done in an organization that stated that individuals who are a certain age, there's people with a certain age, they're more facile than others of another age. However, you can bridge that gap by having pairs in place, by having mentor-mentee type of relationships, so that way you can pass on knowledge. So yeah, there are a few companies, matter of fact, I've worked with, who have developed some very concrete strategies around that type of thing. I was working with Verizon on one product, and a few others too. So yeah.
Yeah, that's actually a pretty popular concept now, is reverse mentoring. And also, frankly, with millennials, it's not hard to do, because if you think about the evolution of corporations, they kind of started in the 40s with a military model. You had the general and a top down. Millennials don't care. They see themselves as equivalent to the CEO, and they just got there yesterday. So they really don't see any distinction whatsoever. And so the idea of bringing these ideas to leadership and telling them what they think, very, very apt to do that anyway.
We have a chat from Judy that talking about that we're discussing parity, equity, diversity, inclusion, but aren't we also talking about emotional intelligence, recognizing and tackling inclusiveness, connection, and diversity? And I know for us at PEAR, talking about emotional intelligence, I mean, we do that every day.
I'll give you a quick one on that one, right? So what happens is that in organizations, unfortunately, many times when we're recruiting, we put a lot of emphasis on what we call IQ. However, IQ can get you there, but it won't keep you there, and it won't progress you. So what you have to have is the EQ, so that way you're able to understand more about yourself and how to relate with others and how to relate with the organization. The third piece of that is that you need to have CQ, because in a global organization, we need to understand the cultural quotient. How can we work with people from different countries and understand that better? That was the only thing that helped me as I was VP of different international divisions. I had to develop my CQ to understand, well, when I go into Nigeria, what do I do? When I go into Russia, or if I'm going into Czech Republic, how do I talk with people? Yeah, I mean, what do I do in Chile, that might be different from Costa Rica even, those type of things. So yes, EQ is extremely important. Trying to be succinct in my responses.
Oh, absolutely. Do we have any other questions? Approaching the hour. So I have one question then for both Philip and Barbara. The name of this the name of this webinar talks about are we in a moment or are we in a movement? So Philip and Barbara, what do you think? Where do we stand? Is this a moment, or is this really truly a movement happening right now?
Barbara, answer the last one. Why don't you take that? You want me to go?
I'll take it.
Yeah.
I think the jury's still out, frankly. I don't know. And I say that because we've been here before in many ways with many issues, and there seems to be momentum, and then things just kind of fall flat. I am encouraged by something that Philip alluded to earlier, is that last summer there was an outcry, not only from people of color, but from the world. And I'm also encouraged because we have a millennial generation, which is much more socially responsible, interested in social responsibility, and who I think are going to demand that some of these issues be addressed as part of their agenda. So I am encouraged.
Okay.
I think I'm also encouraged from that too, and I'll tell you why. You know, maybe I'm a person that looks at things. You know, I'm an optimist, and I believe in trying to make progress out of what you have. What's been instructive is that when the press conference came about with George Floyd, it was in Korea, it was in the Philippines, it was in the UK, it was in Australia as part of the news. That's really good. I'm encouraged when I see the micro inequities that have been taking place in the United States, you know, regarding removing what I call an environmental micro inequity is having statues and flags, you know, that communicate how people are bad and how maybe you don't belong. Those just came up in the 1920s, by the way, all those Confederate statues. They didn't come up in the 1860s, by the way. But what I'm encouraged by is in Bristol, in the UK, they removed the statue of a person who was a slave trader. You know, I mean, that movement spread there. I mean, I'm encouraged when I see a number of people in the Middle East when talking about women's rights, you know, and seeing the type of stance that they are taking in order to have a better role for women in organizations and in society. You know, so all of those type of things, you know, encourage me, and I'm encouraged by the young people because they're going to inherit this. And Deidre was talking about what's going to happen. They're going to inherit this. If we can pass on some of that knowledge to them, that's going to be very good. So when John Lewis also in Georgia mentors a Jewish person to be senator at the same time that he is mentoring an African-American to be a senator. And then we see some of the changes that have taken place in Georgia based on that. I'm encouraged by the fact that we have a female, Black and Asian vice president. I'm encouraged.
All right. Okay. So it is, look at that. It is exactly 1 o'clock. So I really thank everybody for joining us today. This was an amazing discussion. Philip and Barbara, thank you so much for everything on this. I've really enjoyed this whole process, getting to know both of you through this as well. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, David. Thank
Very
you very
nice talking
much.
with you
Yeah.
today.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, you too, Barbara.
Bye-bye.
Okay, thanks,
Hold
everybody.
on. Excellent.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everybody.